Uh, really warm welcome. If you don't know me, my name is Mark Lainsmith. I'm chaplain up at the University of Reading, and Cafe Theological is run in partnership with the Bishop of Reading's office, and its remit is to bring theology or theological ideas and contemporary issues into the public domain for people to ask questions about them, to think about them, to respond to them. So very warm welcome in person, very warm welcome to those joining us on Zoom and to all those who are watching the video on YouTube. Delighted this evening to have as my special guest Steve Tinning. Steve is a Baptist minister. He's been working for the Baptist Union for 2 or 3 years as the, I've got your title, Public Issues Enabler. Steve is seconded to work with the Joint Public Issues team. I'll let him tell you a little bit more about that presently. We're going to have a sort of talk for about 45 minutes or so, then take a break so you can recharge your glasses, and then we'll have wider conversations afterwards, and we'll aim to finish on the dot by 9 o'clock at the very latest. So I'd like us to welcome Steve.
The clap is as warm when you've finished as when you started, won't it? But thank you. It is a real privilege and pleasure to be with you this evening. As Mark said, I'm Steve, I work for the Baptist Union and for the Joint Public Issues team, which stands for JPIT, which is JPIT, which stands for the Joint Public Issues team, which essentially is this collaboration between the Baptist Union, the United Reformed Church and the Methodist Church to speak and act on issues of peace and justice. And we have these things that define the areas in which we work closely together, called our 6 hopes. And I just wanted to flag them up to you today so that you knew a bit about the context in which I'm coming from. My job is to help Baptist churches and Baptist Christians engage in these 6 areas of society. So we hope for a society where the poorest and most marginalised are at the centre. We hope for a world which actively works for peace. We hope for a planet where our environment is renewed. We hope for a politics that is characterised by listening, kindness and truthfulness. Yeah, that's one of the most ambitious ones. Yeah, don't worry about climate change, that's easy compared to we hope for a just economy that enables the flourishing of all life. And we hope for a society that welcomes the stranger. And it's that 6th one that I want to come and share something with you about today. So let's give you, we're going to do this in sort of 3 areas. We're going to talk about the context in which we exist and where our politics in the UK addresses issues of immigration. Then we're going to change gear a little bit and have some reflective time thinking about some images of refugees from around the world and how they reflect on the Stations of the Cross and the journey of Christ's own suffering. And then I'm going to tell you another story at the end about a refugee family that I've had the pleasure to come alongside in recent years. And then we'll take a break and we'll come back together for any questions and thoughts that you want to add in. I appreciate I'm going to do a lot of the talking first, but truthfully, I really want to hear back from you about your experience of this, your questions, your context as well. So the United Nations High Commission for Refugees estimate, they're probably the best route to make this estimation, so you can be fairly confident with these statistics, that there are around 110 million forcibly displaced people worldwide as of mid-2023 as a result of persecution, conflict, violence, human rights violations, or seriously disturbing public orders. Over half of them, 52%, are from just 3 countries: Syria, Afghanistan, and Ukraine. 75% of them are currently hosted in developing countries. So only 25% are being hosted by the countries that theoretically can afford to host them well. This, you'll have to forgive me because this is the area of the 6 hopes that I'm most passionate about for good reason. Every now and again, I'll stumble over words because I find it horribly emotive. 40% of those are children. 43.3 million children are displaced because of violence and persecution and conflicts. That doesn't stir you. Well, I hope it will do by the end of the night anyway. Since 2015, around 28,000 refugees have arrived in the UK on resettlement programs in partnership with the United Nations and with the International Organisation for Migration. 76% of arrivals have been refugees from Syria. And then the closest second is Iraq, 5.2% of them, Somalia, 4.4%, Sudan, 4.1%, and then there are other countries like Afghanistan, Eritrea, Democratic Republic of Congo, Myanmar, and South Sudan that follow after that. Those are primarily where we have received refugees through official safe routes in partnership with the UNHCR. But on top of that, around 190,000 Ukrainians have arrived in the UK as a result of the Ukrainian sponsorship scheme that you may know about. You may know people that have been, you may be involved in it yourself, but I'm certain you would have heard of it. They are technically not refugees in the way that our country understands it. They're not given refugee status in the UK. They're given humanitarian visas, which is a technical thing, but essentially they don't get the same sort of benefits and rights that refugees have. There's an expectation and anticipation that they will one day go home again. But essentially the headline here is that since the scheme for Syria closed, the UK's commitment to safe routes has diminished dramatically. As this graph demonstrates, the number of channel crossings since 2019 has increased exponentially by those from countries that have a strong record of receiving a positive outcome on their asylum claims, i.e. those with a strong case for protection, while the UK's offer to these people for safe routes is now extremely negligible. Overall, this is where channel crossings have gone in the last 4 years, or 5 years. 2018, there were 299 recorded cases of people coming across the channel on small boats. The next year, over 1,800. The year after that, over 8,000. The year after that, over 28,000. Last year, over 45,000 people travelled between mainland Europe and the UK in small boats. Simultaneously, the number of safe routes, as I've said, have started to decrease. Truthfully, the only way that you can come to the UK as a refugee through a safe route now is if you are under certain situations, and I'll explain what some of those are. If you come from Afghanistan, there are two pathways, routes for safe passage for you to come to the UK. One was called ARAP and was primarily for those who worked alongside the British government during their action in Afghanistan. And then there's another group called ACRS, which are for those members of those citizens of Afghanistan that have particular threat to their lives, can apply to come to the UK as a result of those things. There's around 21,000 people have come to the UK under those two main schemes. In January 2022, the government formally opened the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme, so the second of those two, vowing to resettle 5,000 Afghan refugees in the first year and 20,000 overall. Despite these promises, in 2022, only 22 Afghan refugees have been settled in the UK through that scheme, and only 72 overall, with only 141 coming through family reunion pathways. So a commitment of 20,000, so far 72. The second scheme is one called the United Kingdom Resettlement Scheme. That sort of grew out of the Syrian scheme that saw 20,000 Syrian refugees come. They started a UK resettlement scheme in partnership with the UNHCR to prioritise refugees coming from the regions in greatest conflict around the world. Since in the year up to March 2023, only 1,056 asylum, refugee visas had been granted under that scheme. The UNHCR has not been provided with a quota for that scheme. Normally they have targets of how many they're going to meet, but they haven't been given a target for how many they would like to bring in since 2020. And they've been instructed to restrict any new submissions except in highly exceptional circumstances or on an ad hoc basis. Essentially, it amounts to just a handful a year that are coming through that scheme at the moment. There's another scheme called the Community Sponsorship Scheme that I might tell you a little bit about later on. If you don't know about that, it's a really interesting scheme and really empowering to people like yourselves who can welcome refugees to the UK safely through your own strength and power and fundraising and organising. But sadly, in the last year, only 309 people have come to the UK through that scheme. There's something called Refugee Family Reunion. In the last 12 months, children and partners of refugees that have status and permission to stay in the UK can apply to have their children and or their partners brought to the UK. And in the last year, there's been 6,029 visas through that route. And then there's something called the Mandate Resettlement Scheme to resettle refugees who have a close family member in the UK who can offer a home to them. 6 have resettled through that scheme in the last year, around 20 a year in previous years. That's the state of affairs for Safe Routes. I see a lot of shaking heads, so I know I'm amongst friends. This is not good news, people. 110 million people, and these schemes are all we've got by way of safe routes. So it is no wonder, is it not, that people are having to resort to other ways to come to the UK because of their language or because they have family members here. In recent years, there has been a flurry of government policies on immigration that have famously become more and more hostile to refugees and asylum seekers, and Christian leaders and churches have been very outspoken against most of these policies. This one was around something called the Nationality and Borders Bill that was passed a couple of years ago that separated those who came through safe routes and those who came through irregular routes and treated them with different rights and priorities. We campaigned vigorously against that one. But this year, there was perhaps an even more heinous bill that was passed into law called the Illegal Migration Bill. I'm not being very guarded, am I, about how I feel about this, but I sense I'm amongst friends. But please, if you have questions about why I feel this way, hopefully I'll come on to explain a bit about that. But we can maybe talk a bit about that later. But this illegal migration bill became an act a few months ago, and it's part of Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman's ambition to stop the boats. Churches and Christian leaders have been publicly outspoken against that as well. The consequences of this act are vast and wide, but essentially the government said that this is why they were doing it. They said it is to change the law so that those who arrive in the UK illegally will not be able to stay here and will instead be detained and then promptly removed either to their home country or a safe third country, brackets, like Rwanda. It's come under a lot of criticism. The United Nations High Commission for Refugees that I mentioned earlier said this about the bill. They said, the UNHCR is profoundly concerned by new legislation introduced by the UK government into the House of Commons on the Tuesday, the 7th of March 2023. The legislation, if passed, and it has passed now, would amount to an asylum ban, extinguishing the right to seek refugee protection in the United Kingdom for those who arrive irregularly, no matter how compelling their case may be. And that's a really important thing to understand. Now that the Illegal Migration Bill Act has passed, if people are coming from Syria, if people are coming from Afghanistan, from Iran, people have very compelling cases to be protected and historically would have been accepted. The majority of people that come across on boats, after appeal at least, have their asylum applications upheld. So please understand that. These aren't, whatever the media may say, and certain aspects of the media may say, The vast majority of those who come across on boats, in front of a court of law in the UK, make a case to prove that they are deserving of our protection. But now, none of those cases will be heard in the courts. If they've come across on small boats, it doesn't matter where you come from or how compelling your case, you will not have your case heard in this country anymore. Instead, you will be detained, and once the government have found a route to send asylum seekers to a third country like Rwanda, that will be your fate, whether you like it or not. Churches have joined the critical voices, and over 1,500 church leaders wrote to the Prime Minister earlier this year, and they said this, and I'm going to read the whole statement because I think it hopefully gives you some idea of where most church leaders are coming from in this. Bearing in mind this comes from Christian leaders, I think this is quite strongly worded, but maybe it needs to be even more. We are appalled by the proposals in the government's illegal migration bill to detain, punish, and reject thousands of people seeking safety. They are completely incompatible with our Christian conviction that all human beings are made in the image of God and are therefore inherently worthy of treatment which honours their dignity. Instead of dignity, these plans will foster discrimination and distrust and cause immeasurable harm to people already made vulnerable by conflict and persecution. If ever there was a contemporary example of ignoring our neighbour and walking by on the other side, this is it. When 2 in 3 people who have crossed the channel to seek sanctuary in the UK are granted asylum following rigorous checks, it seems unthinkable to reject them before they have even had a chance to have their claim for asylum heard. Many people fleeing war and persecution in countries like Iraq, Iran, Syria, Eritrea, and Sudan have been left with no safe and accessible routes to claim asylum in the UK, forcing people to make difficult and dangerous decisions. The UK falls far behind our global neighbours in welcoming people seeking sanctuary into our communities, and yet these plans essentially put a ban on claiming asylum and rejects the UK's responsibility to play our part in responding to global inequalities and conflict. We all agree that we cannot continue to see thousands of people risk their lives to reach safety in the UK, but the solution cannot be deterrence and punishment. As Christians, we believe that we should be amongst the first to welcome the stranger with open arms. We urge the government to withdraw this legislation, to honour our moral and intentional obligations, and to behave with compassion and fairness by establishing safe and accessible routes to enable the UK to play its part in welcoming people in need of safety. I hope if you'd have seen that, you might have joined us in signing that letter. I won't read the reply. It wasn't worth the paper it was written on. But theologically, I hope we're on fairly safe ground here. It seems to me that the biblical case for supporting those in need of protection could not be clearer. Sam Wells, the Minister of St Martin's in the Field in London, wrote an excellent article criticising the government's Rwanda policy, and in it he said that the Bible is founded on migration stories, migration journeys, all of which have a bearing on immigration policy for us today. Jacob and his entourage migrated to Egypt on a journey of survival in the midst of famine. Moses and the children of Israel migrated from Egypt to the Promised Land as they were refugees from slavery. They take 40 years to reach their destination, and of course, when they get there, it is far from a hospitable environment. It is an extremely hostile environment that they find themselves in. Judah loses a battle and is displaced 500 miles to Babylon. And there, as Daniel shows, exiles play a vibrant part in the public life, bringing unique qualities to the society in which they have settled, represented, of course, by the ability to interpret dreams. Jesus himself, of course, becomes a refugee. If you like that image that was up on the screen when you came, you can order them as Christmas cards. I had to crop it a bit, but there's a sort of Christmas star in the sky. This image of Jesus and Mary and Joseph on a small boat contemporary example of how Jesus, as a small child, had to flee to Egypt to escape the wrath of Herod. He also travelled, of course, from Galilee to Jerusalem, living in a context where Israel had been occupied by the invading Roman powers. And finally, Paul migrates from Jerusalem to Rome. He is in search of legal protection in an empire where the citizenship transcends geography. This is the context of the entirety of our scripture. Sam says this: most of what we today call migration is in the Bible. And it's through migration, not in spite of it, that revolution occurs. Over and again, from Abraham's 3 visitors to Gabriel's annunciation to Mary, the stranger comes to God's people as a gift. The point of the Good Samaritan parable is not that we should give a little of our bounty to help those by the wayside, but to realise that we are all in the gutter, and Jesus comes to us in the form of a stranger, perhaps one we despised or thought was our enemy. Of course, the current pattern of migration is a challenge, but in theological terms, it is a challenge to be received, not a problem to be fixed, but as an opportunity to be received as a gift. I'd encourage you to look that up. It's in an article on, it might be the Church Times, but it's worth dwelling in that quote for a bit. If we had time, we might talk about it more. But at this point, I just want to change the pace of what we're talking about and look at these images. They were photos taken by an artist called Mark Steen Adamson a number of years ago. They were pictures taken in refugee camps around the world and curated to help us to reflect on the Stations of the Cross at Lent. So I'm going to show the pictures up on the screen above us and tell you just a sentence or two about the person that you're going to see. And then I want to read a part of scripture from the story of the cross and ask a question for you just to hold in silence for 30 seconds or so. We're not going to turn to neighbours and have conversations about this. We just don't have time. But I just think when we're doing theology, there's lots of different ways to look at this, isn't there? And I'm a practical theologian. I'm not an academic. I'm here to read scripture to understand something of God and then apply it to our contemporary text. So this first picture is called Alone. Amira, the woman in the photo, her husband has left her, and she is raising her 6 young children in a bedsit in Beirut, in Lebanon. Her eldest son, who is 10 years old, can't go to school because he has to work to provide for the family. Matthew 26 says, he told them, my soul is crushed with grief to the point of death. Jesus said to his disciples, stay here and keep watch with me. He went on a little further and he bowed with his face to the ground, saying, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup of suffering be taken from me. Yet I want your will to be done, not mine. Then he returned to the disciples and he found them asleep. Christ knew suffering, and he hoped his friends would walk with him in it, supporting him in his time of need. But they couldn't even stay awake. Couldn't stay alert to the threat. It is hard to be constantly alert to the needs of refugees and asylum seekers, especially when they're not in the headlines, but it can be a very lonely experience for them, both before and after they are settled. So my question is, I wonder whether the current situation in Ukraine or in Gaza has awoken you to the plight of refugees. How might we stay alert to the needs of the most vulnerable? in the world and even in our community? Let's just hold that question for a few seconds. Has the situation in Gaza awoken you to the plight of refugees? How might we stay awake to the needs of the most vulnerable in the world? This is the next picture of this picture. Don't love the title as much, it's called Betrayal. The photo is a kiss between playmates in a camp for Syrian refugees. A kiss is an image or an expression of affection and trust, something rarely experienced by refugees. And of course, the passage for this one is Luke 22. While he was still speaking, a crowd came up, and the man who is called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached to Jesus to kiss him. Jesus asked him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? Being betrayed is a common experience for refugees as well. I watched a Ukrainian man crying on the news as he spoke about the Russians' assertion that they are ridding Ukraine of Nazis. He said this, he said, now you understand, I am from Crimea, and my friends who live there think it's just like that. And I have to say that my former friends, you betray me. You are supporting Putin, who is a fascist, a real one. My family is hiding in the basement now because of you monsters. I'm telling you, it's really scary to watch it. My friends who are in Kyiv, they're sitting in their basements and hiding because they are being bombed by Russian missiles. When will it stop? People are being betrayed and are looking for people they can trust. So the question is, who do you trust? And why do you trust them? What is a true example of trustworthiness? What is a true example of trustworthiness? Is our next image? It's a man who had been working with the British Army, and he had hoped that the British might help him, given that he had worked alongside the forces, but he was left in Calais with no access to the UK. Matthew 26 says this, those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled, but Peter followed him at a distance right up to the courtyard of the high priest. He entered and sat down with the guards to see the outcome. Chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they did not find any, though many false witnesses had come forward. Finally, 2 came forward and declared, this fellow said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. There are countless lies told about refugees that make their plight even more tragic. So the question is, can you think of a time a lie was told about you? How did it feel? And how can we protect ourselves from lies told about others? When you think of a time a lie was told about you, how does it feel? How can we protect ourselves from lies told about others? This photo is called Words. The little girl and her family have been marooned in a tiny flat in Beirut, forced to survive on what little they can earn and handouts from friends. while the government in the UK is saying we're doing all we can. We are doing all we can. Matthew 26 again says, Jesus told them, this very night you will all fall away on account of me. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. Peter replied, even if all fall away on account of you, I never will. Good intentions are not enough. Peter didn't think that he was capable of the things that Jesus foresaw of him. But the truth was, when the moment came, that he didn't manage to keep his word. In recent years, the government has said we will be generous. We will do all that we can, promising support for thousands of Afghan refugees, but very little has materialised. So we have to ask, are these just words? Or will the government follow through? The question is, what do you believe would be a practicable but generous movement towards today's refugees? We're not talking about open borders here. We're talking about doing our bits, doing what is fair. So what do you believe would be a practical but generous movement towards today's refugees? This photo is entitled Humiliation. Tarzan endured years of insults and violence, closed borders and closed doors, but now he lives in the UK and is waiting for his wife and 7-year-old son to arrive from Tehran after 4 years of being separated. John 19 says, Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. Soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns, put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, Hail, King of the Jews. They slapped him in the face. Refugees endure all kinds of humiliation. They are caged like animals. They have their rights withheld. They're forced to live with barely any money and have choices taken away from them regularly. They are constantly reminded how privileged they are to receive any help at all. But a guest really feels at home when they are told they do not have to take their shoes off. And the question is, how might we improve the dignity of those we seek to help? With that one, I'm reminded recently of the story that some of you may have seen about how the Centres for Child Asylum Seekers had images of cartoon characters painted over because it was too welcoming. It's got 3 more. This one's entitled Sold. It's a woman who had walked hundreds of miles in order to be with her children and husband who had gone ahead of her to Beirut. She had intended on staying in Syria to give birth, but there were problems with the pregnancy and the baby died. She nearly died too, but she was rescued when friends paid for her medical treatment. Luke 23 says a large number of people followed him, including a woman who mourned and wailed for him. Jesus turned and said to them, Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, Weep for yourselves and for your children. The suffering of female refugees is particularly acute. Ukrainian women are having to leave their husbands behind and embark on journeys alone, and their vulnerability is unquestionable. So too is their courage and their strength. So how do you cope when faced with the suffering of others? Do you avoid it? Do you turn the channel over? Do you allow it to confront you and challenge you? Personally, I find that a very difficult question to be truthful about. I live this stuff quite daily, so when it gets to the end of the day and it's a choice between watching what's happening in Gaza today or turning over to Dave and watching Have I Got News for You or 8 out of 10 cats, I'm just being honest with you. It's hard to constantly be battered with the suffering of other people. You have to make at least some space for that time. An ultimate one is entitled Family. This is an Iraqi woman, Salma, whose husband had been brutally killed. One of her children was kidnapped, and so when they were eventually reunited, she fled to Syria, of all places. And then when fighting broke out there, she fled to Turkey, and now she lives in the UK, but she is separated from 2 of her other children she holds in a picture frame, with no way of being reunited with them because she doesn't have any documentation proving that they are her children. John 19 says, near the cross of Jesus stood his mother, and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother there, and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son." And to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that time on, the disciple took her into his home. You and I might differ on some of the technicalities about what I'm talking about today, but I hope we can agree that refugee children should have the right to be reunited with their parents and with their family. But barriers are constantly being put up. Reunification for families in the UK is extremely limited. Jesus understood the need for vulnerable people to need family, including extended family. So how do we expand our horizons as to whom we count as family? Last one. This photo is called Trust. And the explanation is simply this: a father holds his daughter, who puts her life in his hands. Luke 23 said, "It was about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. The sun stopped shining, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Jesus called out in a loud voice, 'Father, into your hands I commit my spirit.' When he had said this, he breathed his last." In whom do we put our trust? Friends, family, God? Perhaps an even more challenging question: who puts their trust in you? Do you think asylum seekers and refugees can and should put their trust in the UK for their support? How can we transform a narrative of fear and hostility into one of love and trust? maybe one or two of those questions struck you more than the other, and that is absolutely fine. And perhaps in our 10-minute break in a moment, you can turn to the person next to you and say the one that you found most difficult to answer honestly. But before we get there, and I'm nearly finished, I just want to share a story with you. It's an uplifting story, ultimately. It's good to finish on a high, isn't it? It's the reason why I care so much about asylum seekers and refugees, and really it's the route into this. I was minister of a church in Southend in Essex at the time the Syrian war broke out, and I remember seeing the body of little Alan Kurdi. Do you remember this? He was on the front pages of every newspaper and most TV programs as well. There's a little 3-year-old toddler whose body had washed up on the beach. And it was quite a startling image. And for some reason, I mean, I've seen tragic news stories in the past. Of course, we see this all the time, don't you? For some reason, and maybe it was because it wasn't long after I'd become a dad myself. Well, I think my daughter would have been about Alan's age when this happened. It hit me like a stone wall. I was overwhelmed with sadness for this poor boy and wanted to do something about it. And Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, made this pledge to welcome through a safe route 20,000 Syrian refugees over a 5-year period. And it was all on the understanding that local councils would make pledges to welcome Syrian refugees into their communities. And Southend, the town at the time that I lived in, made no pledges at all. And so as a group of church leaders, we got together to write a letter to the council to say we really expect more of you, and we should be playing our part and doing our bit. And so there was this big campaign, and we got it in the press a little bit. It said 20 church, faith and charity leaders in Southend write to the Echo, that's the local newspaper, to say that they would house Syrian refugees in their own homes. Incidentally, we didn't say that, but let's not split hairs. And fund school places. Sounds a bit like Ukraine before Ukraine happened, didn't it? But we were trying to encourage them and saying we will do our part in showing hospitality to them. And over a long period of negotiation, the council made this commitment. We'd asked them to take 100 refugees. They agreed to take 2 families on the understanding that those families would be housed in accommodation that wasn't owned by the council. They couldn't justify taking places, which, you know, in fairness, I understood, okay? But this wasn't quite what we'd hoped for, nevertheless. And at the time, the church that I was a minister of owned a flat, and it had some people in there paying rent, and it just so happened that the week that the council agreed this statement, we got a letter from the tenants of our flat saying that they were moving out, and suddenly I was sensing God's Spirit talking to me, and hopefully us as a church. And I said to the church, well, we've gone on this journey, we've done fundraising, we did that Lent exhibition of those photos and others, we've campaigned locally, and now I think God is telling us we need to show hospitality. So we offered the flat to the council, and a few months later I had the privilege of picking up Abdul and Fatima, his wife, and Nuran on the bike. And that's my little girl, blurred out for some reason. I can't remember why I did that. There's no reason you couldn't see her, but she's like taller than me now. Anyway. And that's Abdul and Fatima and Nuran. They're Syrian refugees from Aleppo, and they came to the UK. And this is Anwar. He was born in the UK a year or two into their time living in Southend. Their youngest son, but they have 2 other sons as well. This is Mahmoud and Mohammed. Mahmoud is on the left and Mohammed's on the right. Mahmoud fled with Abdul and Fatima and Noran to Turkey when the war broke out and Aleppo was being bombed. But sadly, when the government said that they could come as a result of this scheme, they left Mohammed in Turkey because he was over 18 years old and he was considered an independent male adult. So they split the family up and brought mum and dad and teenage daughter, left their son in Turkey. Their other son, Mohammed, didn't have a passport when they left Syria. They left at the time of the war where the borders were still open, so the way to get out was using their passport. Mohammed didn't have a passport, so the plan was, well, wait for your passport to arrive and then catch us up. And sadly, before that could happen, the Syrian army turned up at their house to recruit him to the army, and when he refused to fight, they put him in prison in Damascus and tortured him for 4 years. He was 17, and they took him. So Abdul and Fatima and Nuran came, and we had ideas of what they would need in terms of a bus parts, and we were very proud of ourselves. Very progressive Christian church that had a washing facility in their bathroom that we'd installed because they're Muslims and they had certain hygiene requirements, and we thought, pat ourselves on the back, well done for understanding their needs. Little did we know what they really needed was to be reunited with their sons. Caused them great distress. But Nuran was an extraordinary young girl. She was 15 when she came to the UK. This is her with a man called Alf Dub. Some of you might have heard of. He was a refugee on the Kindertransport in the Second World War. Came from Czechoslovakia and came to the UK. Is now a Lord in the House of Lords and a fierce advocate for the rights of child refugees. And this is a meeting in the House of Lords with Alf and Yvette Cooper and a number of others as we launched a campaign to commemorate the anniversary of the Kindertransport. We were trying to ask the government, years and years ago, you welcomed 10,000 unaccompanied children to the UK as a result of their flight in the Second World War. In the context of today's world, wouldn't it be good over 10 years if you welcomed another 10,000 children? So over 10 years, just 1,000 a year, we could commemorate in that situation. And Nuran was drawn into that campaign as a child refugee herself to campaign and to work with us to persuade the UK government of what they might do. Part of that campaign was to ask local councils if they would be prepared to welcome unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, because if the government kept saying to us, but we haven't got enough foster places, the councils won't take them, and we thought, well, if we campaign the local councils and got them to make pledges, it would undermine the government's argument that the councils won't take them. So Nuran was incredible. She wrote a letter to the council asking if they would make this pledge, and the council said no. And so she got together with a group of faith leaders again. We weren't the first time, so we had another go at it the next time. And she spoke in the context of the council. This is her sitting in the town council hall, and she was asking them. She said, "I'll never forget." She said, "I'm here and alive today because of a decision you made in this room 4 years ago. And I would like you to save the lives of other children." And so the council made this statement: "We will support the Our Turn campaign and give sanctuary to 3 child refugees a year on the understanding that the government responds positively to the campaign." And she won that commitment from Southend Council. She was going from strength to strength. She took the campaign to Parliament Square. I had a big meeting in Friend's house in London, the Quaker Place, where they got these survivors from the Kindertransport to come and make their pledges at it. Esther Ransom was one of the speakers there, and a bunch of other people. Esther Ransom was there because when she was a TV show host, had a chap, what's his name? Nicholas Winton, came. He was one of the people that was instrumental in bringing people along the Kindertransport. He kept a ledger of all the children who he had helped get onto the Kindertransport and come and be saved. And he kept it in his loft. And it was decades before his children found this and realised what an incredible thing he'd done. And so they'd written to Esther Ransom and said, "Look what my dad's done." And she got him on the show and then had this, you can watch it on YouTube, this heartbreaking moment where he says, "If you're one of the children that Nicholas Winton brought to the UK and to whom you owe him your life, would you please stand up?" And the whole, getting choked up, the whole audience stands up as he realises what an incredible thing he'd done. She went on to appear on Sky News and won awards for her campaigning. She's an incredible advocate for the rights of children. I'm just going to skip through this. I will say this bit. She just wrote, again, this is about the threat of family reunion being taken away after Brexit. And she said, "When I heard that family reunion is under threat, I knew I needed to stand up. I'm here with my mum and my dad and my little brother, but my older brothers aren't here. And I cry whenever we speak. My parents are very stressed that we are not all together." Mahmoud is still in Turkey. He's okay. He would love to come here, especially since the earthquake, because the house in which he was staying was almost destroyed entirely by the earthquake, and so he's much more vulnerable than he was. But he was starting to make a bit of a life for himself. He found a wife, and while the family wanted to be reunited with him, I think they recognised that the challenge that being reunited with him was going to be not going to be easy, if at all possible. We still hope and pray that he will be reunited. With Mohammed, we went on a real journey of trying to get him released from prison, working with the Red Crescent, the Red Cross, the UNHCR, and others. Eventually, he was released on the understanding that he would report to the army, which of course he didn't. But they used to get pictures of ways that his body had been tortured, sent to them, so that they would send money to the prison for his medical needs, and they would do enough to keep him alive and siphon off the rest for whatever purposes they wanted. This young boy had been physically and mentally tortured for years, but he eventually made it into Turkey and reunited with his brother for a short time. Truthfully, he needed to be in the UK, but the UK government weren't going to reunite him because now he wasn't under 18 anymore. He'd been in prison and was considered another independent male. And then this is a very long story that I can tell you about another day, but I was invited to speak at a symposium on refugee support and met these three women who were doing a talk at this thing. They're lawyers and solicitors, and I just explained the case and said, I don't know if there's anything you can recommend, a way that we might be able to pursue a way for him to be reunited. And they gave me the card of a solicitor who just started her work in immigration, was looking for some cases to practice in on a sort of pro bono way, and I was saying, any help I can get, I'll take it. And this woman was astonishing. She sent doctors out to Turkey to assess Mohammed, sent doctors to Fatima to do a mental assessment of her and the pain that she was going through being separated from her children. And our MP was David Amis. I don't know if you remember Dave, but he was sadly an MP that was killed, but he'd met with the family on a number of occasions and had advocated with them to the Home Office. A very long story came about. And then one day, Mohammed WhatsApp messaged us a picture of a piece of paper that he had been given by the British Embassy. He said that they called me up and asked me to come because they had something for me, but he doesn't speak English, so he couldn't read it, and they didn't explain what it was. The solicitor had said to us, he will be refused asylum in the UK, and on appeal, about 40% are successful. That was the level of hope that we had, but we believed we had a strong case. Anyway, it wasn't refused. He didn't have to go to appeal. The piece of paper that he'd been given was a visa and permission to come. And this is the image of the reunion at the airport. Someone desperately trying to get her away. No, it's at the front. Abdul's as dignified as ever. He's sort of standing back and letting his wife and daughter have first kisses and hugs. And then Mrs. Anwar, remember, who's never met his brother before, set through WhatsApp, the wonders of technology. We need to have a little break, but safe routes save lives. And if the government really does want desperate people to not have to make dangerous journeys anymore, their plan must be to make a generous commitment to safe routes. It has to be their number one priority. Mahmoud has been queuing up to get on a boat to cross the Mediterranean from Turkey into Italy. And I mean, if you've seen the news headlines on how dangerous a crossing that is, And what a futile journey it will ultimately be, because even if he does make his way to France and tries to come into the UK, our current government policy is his asylum case will not be listened to, and he will be sent away. Safe routes save lives. And I just wanted to make you aware of something that's happening. We can talk maybe after the break for a few minutes on things that you can do. But one of the things I'm working on at the moment is that you may have seen in the headlines that the government are having a big push to close asylum hotels. A lot of hotels, there's some in Reading, are being used to house asylum seekers, but they are not making good headlines, and they have created this backlog of asylum applications that are not reflecting well on the government. So they're under huge pressure to make fast decisions. And where people have come from Syria, Afghanistan, and Iran, and from countries where the asylum application is more often than not upheld, they are expediting those asylum decisions and giving them permission to stay. But in doing so, they have 7 days to arrange new accommodation before they are taken out of those hotels and made homeless. And the responsibility from the government to pay for those hotels then falls on the local councils to figure out what to do if they haven't got anywhere to go. And the councils, as you all know, are on their knees with lack of funding as it is. Simultaneously, last week, the government sent a consultation out to all the local councils asking what capacity they had to welcome refugees through safe routes. Now, call me cynical, but I don't think the timing of those two things are accidental. I think there is an agenda at play here that burdens local councils with responsibilities that until now the government had held. And at the same time asking the councils, what else have you got space for? Because the inevitable answer will be, we haven't got any capacity. And then, as part of the illegal migration bill, there is a commitment in consultation with local councils to put a cap on the number of people that can come through safe routes. And you can only assume that the council's pledges are going to be minuscule because of the pressure that they're under. And before you know it, the commitment to safe routes will reflect that. And so we're going to start to work on a campaign to ask local councils to sign a pledge, or not to sign a pledge, to sign a statement calling out the intentionality behind that move, and to try and shine some light on this so that councils will be properly resourced to be able to provide accommodation and support for people that come through safe routes in the future. I think it's past, we need to take a 5 or 10 minute break, don't we? Thank you. I hope that was helpful, and you might have all sorts of questions. We'll have 10, 15, 20 minutes or so later, but over to you, Mark.
Should we show appreciation, Steve?